Hi everyone, welcome to the Berkeley Debate Colloquium Season Opener Intensive Week 2. Today we're going to be talking about structural versus procedural fairness. I'm Jessica Zhang, one of the co-founders of the Berkeley Debate Colloquium. I'm really glad to have you here with us today. So first, before we dive into the interactions between structural and procedural fairness, I think it's important to define what each of those relative terms are and then go from there. So, we understand procedural fairness as the guarantee that when two teams walk into a round, they have equal access to in-round argumentation from the start of prep time all the way through the conclusion of the round. There are a number of conditions that shape the amount of procedural fairness that exists within a round. One is whether both teams have equal access to speech times and preparation. Another is the ground distribution inherent to the resolution between the affirmative and the negative. And another is finally the structural balance between the affirmative and the negative based on speaker order, the block, the ability to make new arguments, and so on. Once these conditions have been met, it can be articulated that procedural fairness can exist within the round. And there are a number of arguments that articulate why procedural fairness ought to be the value that is maximized or the impact that is maximized within the round via the judge when we talk about procedural or theoretical arguments. The argument that procedural fairness is the only thing we can control in the round refers to the fact that if there is bias or if there is unreciprocal distribution of ground, procedural fairness would be able to alleviate those conditions. Additionally, procedural fairness is key to truth testing, which is a concept in which the validity or the truth of a specific argument requires that it be tested, that there be substantive clash and engagement and back and forth, and the process of iterating upon the validity of this argument is what tests its strength as an argument in the first place. We articulate that procedural fairness and the ability for equal teams to engage in equal ways within the round is the internal link to solving for structural biases, i.e. biases that prefer one argument over the other. We can resolve those via the testing of arguments via substantive engagement and clash. Not only could it lead to tangible material benefits outside of the round, but that it allows us as individual debaters who then do things outside of the debate space to better resolve for structural disparities and material conditions outside of the round. And finally, the argument that supports procedural fairness is that the flow is inevitable, that a flow-centric metric of evaluation is not only going to be the default standard by which competitors are judged, but that this standard is the one that best minimizes the amount of subjective intervention done by a judge or an adjudicator in the round. We're going to contrast this with a conception of structural fairness, which differs from procedural fairness a little bit. Structural fairness is the guarantee of equal access to debate as an activity as a whole, not just within the round. And this structural fairness is shaped by societal forces and structural imbalances in society writ large. Now, what are some of the conditions that shape structural fairness? Well, first is that there are a number of disparities when it comes to access to coaching, access to educational materials, and any type of resource in general. These cause a disparity in structural fairness. Additionally, there are subjective judge biases. A historic example are the way that non-men debaters are treated as less persuasive, less valuable, or performatively less strong than male debaters. This is just one example of many judge biases that exist that deny the equal ability for people to participate and access the debate space. And finally, there are broader social and societal structural inequities that create differences in the ability for different groups to access debate as an activity. You can think of this as racism, sexism, disableism, transmisogyny, or queer violence, and those types of structures writ large. These obviously have an influence in the ability for certain individuals to access debate as a space. So now, what are some of the arguments that argue in favor of structural fairness? Well, first is that the procedural fairness that is articulated within one particular round is absolutely impossible without resolving external structural biases. This would articulate that isolating procedural fairness as only happening in a vacuum within one specific round ignores the way that broader social or structural biases infiltrate the debate space in that particular round, be it coaching or resource disparities or judge biases. Additionally, a narrow-minded focus on procedural fairness within one particular round allows debaters to footnote attempts to resolve structural fairness and essentially kick the can later down the road, articulating that though structural fairness is a thing that should be resolved for, that should play second fiddle to resolving the questions of procedural fairness that are happening within this particular round, excluding all other rounds. And finally, is that structural fairness outweighs procedural fairness on magnitude. We can understand that structural fairness has to do with debate as an activity, and therefore theoretically would include all future rounds within debate as a whole, whereas procedural fairness would only implicate that specific round in which this debate is being held, and thus structural fairness would implicate all of the future rounds together and thus outweigh on magnitude via scope. So that was a very quick comparison on the difference between procedural and structural fairness. Which of these you want to articulate very much depends on the specific conditions that are brought up in the round that you are debating within. Oftentimes, when you are trying to collapse to theory, you want to go for procedural fairness because that allows you to sidestep many of the questions posed and cross-applied by the affirmative team or your opponents in general via a critique or external criticism. If you're defending yourself against theory, perhaps you might consider reading structural fairness as reasons why your opponents focus on procedural fairness trades off from broader social questions that implicate factors such as racism, sexism, ableism, and more. Interactions between these two arguments are the subject of deeper analysis in one of our supplemental videos titled Week 2 Survival Strategies in Depth, as well as the round recording for the second week that we have sent out to everybody in advance. Please be sure to flow this round and really thoroughly understand the various interactions between the arguments, because that will make this explanation a lot more helpful. Thank you for joining us for the Berkeley Debate Colloquium Season Opener Intensive Week 2. This has been a quick and dirty video about the difference between structural and procedural fairness, and I'm very thankful to have you here with us, and I hope you got something out of this video today. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.